Okay, now we're going to talk about the social life of human remains. And what I mean by that is the theoretical contributions that have been made to how we as archaeologists can interpret and understand not only who these people were, but what their societies in which they lived were like. The main way we do this is through what we call bioarchaeology, and that is the interdisciplinary and problem-oriented study of human remains from archaeological contexts. Bioarchaeology was part of this introduction of what's called new archaeology, which was a response to this sort of stagnant cultural historical approach that prevailed in archaeology. When new archaeology came around, there was an increased focus on the use of what are called processual methods to examine interaction between culture and biology. The concept of bioarchaeology and its definition as a field of study was defined by Jane Dykstra, who's actually a faculty at ASU, in 1977. It in itself was a theoretical response, as I said, to this sort of cultural historical archaeology of the 1940s and 60s. Processual archaeology is a turn toward the use of more scientific methods to learn about how the people who used artifacts live. And Louis Binford, who we see in the image here, was a big proponent of this. This paradigm shift within archaeology was, again, this critique of the cultural historical phase of describing and cataloging artifacts and defining cultural history regions that way. Instead, the emphasis was on systems and describing or defining the sort of adaptive cultural processes that led to cultural change that we could observe. Of course, in reaction to that then was what's called post-processual archaeology, and this was a movement within the discipline to emphasize the subjectivity of archaeological interpretations, and it was also a way to embrace a wider variety of theoretical viewpoints. So Ian Hodder, who was the main force behind this movement, was a critique of, they were critiquing the lack of human agency within archaeology, the sort of objectivity of interpretation that has become quite prevalent in the study. There was a failure to account for factors like gender, ethnicity, identity, and social relations, and as you've noticed, we talk about all of those sorts of things within anthropological archaeology and anthropology more generally, so we shouldn't be ignoring those within archaeology. And it was also criticizing the ethical and sort of political irresponsibility when it came to burials in particular. So broadly, post-processual thinking has inspired the sort of detailed analysis of human remains and things in greater detail than previously possible. So the treatment of the corpse, as an example, reflects the construction of social identities and the place of the corpse within society. The body itself is seen as a social phenomenon. We see the sort of self-identity, ideology, and beliefs of the people, what sort of thoughts were contemporaneous within their society at the time they were buried. There are, however, changes through time, and at times we can start to see this and learn more about society and culture change more generally. Now, there are particular contexts that we talked about in the last lecture, inhumation versus cremation. Today we're going to talk about something even more specific, which is the burial of bodies within peat bogs. Now, these are considered secondary rites, but usually don't have to do with cannibalism. I'm not sure why I left that on the slide here. To understand these sorts of burials, we need to introduce a concept called materiality. And that's what we do in archaeology. We study the material cultures themselves because they have an influence on the people, but also objects themselves have an influence in daily life. So we often ask ourselves, do objects themselves have agency? If something is a particular symbol or has such meaning or significance to a person or a society, in that way we can see that they're kind of acting on environments or people themselves. What is the impact of these objects or the agency with which they affect people's lives and thoughts? So we're going to look at a few unique bioarchaeological cases, And in that case, what we're talking about are when human remains are extremely well preserved, and because of that, we can actually learn quite a bit more than we usually could. Mummification is probably the most obvious example of this. This is the preservation of soft tissues, which can actually occur in several different ways. One being extremely dry environments. So here in the Southwest, there are some cave structures where we see, the reeds that are preserved in matting of like floors or carpet sort of things. The shoes people would have made out of agave fibers. These things are preserving because of the heat and the dry environment. There's also obviously the intentional body treatment that we'll see in Egypt. In the last part of this module, we also find burials like this in Peru. There are also, however, highly acidic and oxygen-free peat bogs, and this is more specific to northwestern Europe. And they tend to provide some pretty well-known examples from the past, so we're going to focus here on bog bodies, but you might have also heard of a famous case called Ötzi the Iceman. There's a great NOVA special that I show in my archaeology class that gets into that case study in more detail. So bog bodies are these sort of well-preserved human remains that we find within peat bogs, specifically within northwestern Europe, and they provide a lot of detailed information about past death. So as I said, they're found in the British Isles, Denmark, and Ireland. They tend to date to the Iron Age, which in this case is about 750 to 50 BCE, all the way into the 19th century. The bog environment itself has, this low anaerobic environment which preserves the soft tissue. So there are these unique chemical characteristics of the bog that preserve the tissue. We also see skin, hair, organs in good preservation because of that. The bodies themselves are completely submerged, so the absence of oxygen beneath the peat actually helps to halt the body's decay. There are what are called bog acids, and that actually further inhibits the decay, forming this sort of humid acid, which removes the calcium and actually ends up tanning the skin. That's why the bodies themselves look quite dark. Specialist bioarchaeologists are able to determine cause of death, even if we only have the soft tissue and not the bones themselves to figure out what might have happened. Stomach contents are particularly interesting. They can tell us whatever the last meal was consumed, also the season when a death occurred, depending on the sorts of pollen that they might have been inhaling into their lungs, or could have made it all the way into their stomach. When it comes to a person's identity, the sort of styles they use on their hair, their beard, or fingernails, well, those tissues are preserved, so we can actually see that and learn a lot more about these people. What's interesting, though, is that many of these Iron Age bog bodies tend to have displays of violent deaths. So the Lindo man, for example, which was found in the 1980s, it was an adult male aged early to mid-20s. He had skull fractures, a neck fracture, which they've assumed came from strangling, and then also his throat was cut. The old Crodag man in Ireland, again, another adult male of pretty large stature. He had a stab wound to his chest, cuts on his arms, and it appeared that he might have been disemboweled, dismembered, and definitely tortured. So these violent deaths and dismemberment are quite common. The violent ends themselves are generally interpreted as evidence of group violence, so perhaps punishment for a social transgression, sacrifices of scapegoats to calm community fears or to divine for the future. So if you thought you had a witch or a warlock in your community, maybe you needed to sacrifice someone. The individuals themselves, though, appear to be pretty high status captives. They're well-fed, well-kept, tend to be disease-free, so clearly not someone who'd been in a dank, dark prison for a long time. Because of this, Giles points out that the context of the bog bodies needs to be considered to understand these violent deaths. Well, when we do that, we actually realize that what might appear on surface to be a very desolate place is actually a place where people would have come to find lots of different resources in the past. So the woody plant species that we see there were products that helped them make other sorts of goods. They also had medicinal purposes. The agricultural diets of this time would have been enhanced by, fishing, catching fowl, and other game in the bog environment. And then the peat itself is actually used as fuel that would have helped them in processing iron and also producing other types of crafts. So in that case, these are actually very ritually important areas. And we find other deposits that are interpreted as sorts of ritual offerings. So the bogs are these sort of unique natural features, and because of that, that might have made them cosmologically meaningful. So this process of continual growth and change, or, fertility and production, it also represents the sort of physical manifestation of this liminal state between land and water, as helping with this transition between life and death. So in that case, how we interpret these things depends on the sort of evidence you pay attention to, and it might not be clear one way or the other, but we need to look at the full holistic approach, look at all the evidence that's available in order to try and understand what these bog bodies represented. If you've ever read anything about the Maya, or maybe traveled to Mexico yourself, to the Yucatan Peninsula, there are these geological features in the landscape called cenotes, and they are these sort of cave structures that eventually are fully open to the surface. It's just a feature of the landscape, the way it's formed and the material it's made of. So there are these underground caves, and this is interpreted within Maya ideology as a sort of entrance to the underworld. And what we actually find there are sacrifices themselves, not only goods, animals, but humans as well. And we'll talk more in the next module about human sacrifice as it relates to the politics of death in the past. And we'll also talk about politics of the death in the future.